Numbers are ever pervasive in games. They're what illustrates how the game should work. Everything from how high Mario jumps to how many frames a Shoryuken takes to resolve. Even walking simulators like Gone Home are inseparable from numbers, with walking and camera movement speeds. It's not much of a stretch to say that numbers define games. They are the determinant of the interactivity in our interactive medium. Nowhere is this better felt than in combat systems. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance has that distinctive Platinum feel to it. It's instantly recognizable as a Platinum game as soon as you pick up the controller. It's fast, it's fluid, and it's incredibly responsive. The numbers here work symbiotically with the animations to communicate the pace of combat and the feeling of tightness in the controls. The animations act as the visual signifier, while the numbers act as the tactile feeling that delineates the combat. Metal Gear Rising is a great example of a game that utilizes its numbers well to connect with the player not only tactically, but emotionally. When you play Revengeance, you really feel like you're in control, like you're doing something. You feel necessary, you feel important, like you are something. And that works really well in the context of the game, because you are. Raiden is an overpowered monster, and that's exactly how you feel when the game flows the way you want it to. The game allows you to move just as fast as you like, and hit harder than any normal enemy you'll find yourself fighting. It stirs up feelings of badassery and superiority, mixed with ridiculousness. How could you not chuckle to yourself while calming an entire army of malicious cyborgs to death, ripping out a few of their spines along the way? This feeling is a combination of a lot of elements gone right, but at the core of it, we find the mechanics, and the numbers associated with them. Numbers are often viewed as cold, logical, and devoid of emotion. But they can be used to stunning effect, as we can see here with Revengeance, to inspire emotions by utilizing their capability to represent and define any given facet of a game. We are great at assigning human-like qualities to non-human things, so this shouldn't come as much of a surprise to find a glimpse of humanity in numbers, but they are so often overlooked or forgotten because of what I would assume to be their bad reputation. For an example of this done wrong, we have to look no further than our favorite fighting game of all time, Shaq Fu. Words cannot do justice to how bad this game is to play, and so I urge all of you to go try it for yourselves, preferably with a friend to have a good laugh. I assure you it feels much worse than it looks. Not that it's visually stunning either. It truly is numbers gone wrong. You would expect that a fighting game of all things would get this right, but you couldn't be further from the truth. They've managed to make the fighting itself horrid, and in the process made one of the most hilariously bad fighting games to ever grace this earth. The controls are unresponsive. The game never does what you want it to. Half your inputs are lost to the ether, and the ones that do go through just feel off. The pace is muddled from one moment to another. There's a huge disconnect between what you think your character should be doing and what they are actually doing, which is absolutely crucial for a fighting game to get right. If there were just a few frames of recovery and lag removed here and there, and if the numbers behind the animations better matched what was being communicated through the animations, it wouldn't be nearly so dreadful. They were just a few digits off with everything, but it ended up playing out to horrid effect. Just that little miscalculation on their part resulted in the mess that this game was. Of course, Shaq Fu has many problems that make it such an awful experience, but the numbers are most definitely the core of a lot of them. One of the things I enjoy most about older games is the creativity that was spawned from their limitations. It wasn't possible to express things in the same way that we can now. They couldn't have voice acting, or well-written scripts, or realistic character animations, and they had less time to get their narrative across. Creativity within their limitations was essential in order to get the point across the game wanted to. The budget and technology just weren't there. The most well-known example of this is probably in the musical scores of NES and SNES era games. They didn't have orchestras, artists, or even the hardware to create anything that sounded even remotely like anything that would have been considered contemporary music in the NES's case. Shaq Fu was from this time of creativity cruciality, and is a fairly terrible subject for this theme, but what isn't a terrible subject is an old Sega Genesis game called Shining Force, and its careful consideration of its numbers. For those of you who do not know, Shining Force is a tactical RPG released back in the heyday of the Genesis. It was one of the first in its genre, and was Sega's answer to Fire Emblem. It's far from a copy, however, and really does a great job of setting itself apart from its competition. It's got a ton of personality, a cool combat system, and an utterly lovable cast of characters. And it's this band of warriors that is actually the big focus of the game. Shining Force allowed for a total of 12 party members to be on the battlefield at once, and a total of 30 in the game. This created an immediate problem. The game is not overly long, and most of that time is spent on the battlefield. And as I've previously stated, they didn't really have many methods, let alone the budget, to flesh out this massive cast of characters and to truly dig into their personalities. At most, they get a few lines of dialogue and a character portrait along with a couple of battle animations. Not too much to work with. The genius answer to this conundrum was to define distinctive personalities through the actions that each of them takes on the battlefield. And yep, since the combat itself was limited, they were forced to get creative and manipulate the numbers. Much like the Fire Emblem games, Shining Force has a rudimentary class system that served as the basis for the differentiation of characters. You have your warriors, centaurs, archers, flyers, healers, mages, a whole host of unique classes, and the player character, who will generally wield axes, lances and spears, bows, swords, staves again, unique or no weapons, and swords again, respectively. In addition, there are various types of terrain that affect how far each class can move per turn. So, centaurs usually move the furthest at 7 spaces per turn, but when traveling through hilly or forested terrain, their movement drops all the way down to 2. Warriors fare a bit better in the rougher terrain, being able to move 3 spaces, but can only move 5 normally, and you get the point. The classes are really only there for these reasons, and unique classes can really be anything. The rest of the stats is where it gets interesting. Each class will conform roughly to certain stats that each is good at, but the game really plays around with this variation for some intriguing end results. Probably the best way to explore how Shining Force is manipulating these numbers to the benefit of itself and its characters is to actually look at some of the characters themselves. So let's go ahead and do that. Early on in the game, our first 2 centaurs are introduced to the party, Ken and May. Ken is established as a longtime friend of your character and eager for battle, and that's about all we get. May, on the other hand, is the daughter of the king's head guard, who is also the player character's mentor, Varios. Her father dies near the beginning of the game at the hands of the enemy, Runefaust, and May is driven to help you and your party win the war, avenging her father in the process. Pretty standard stuff here admittedly, and we don't get too much more than that. On the battlefield, Ken is quick and powerful. Being a centaur, he already has some of the furthest movement in the game, but at this point he's also one of the quickest, meaning he gets his turn earlier on than most. He also hits hard, and is able to use both spears and lances, as all centaurs can, which grants him a ton of versatility. All this together means that he is able to build levels very quickly if you can find the right situations. The glaring fault in his character is easily his poor defense. He has good HP, but he needs that because enemy soldiers will be dealing a ton of damage. This is problematic when combined with his other stats, which seem to encourage you to throw him into the heat of battle, swinging wildly at the enemy. Which really goes back to his personality. It sounds just like him. He's immature and aching for battle. He's got talent, but he isn't very refined yet. They managed to replicate his personality perfectly into the way he fights, and it's up to you, the player, to shape how you want him to be played. Will you play him as the glass cannon character that he is at the moment, or will you exercise control, making him seem a bit more mature? Maybe it takes you some time to shift focus from his strengths to his weaknesses, and you serve as the development for his character, as you yourself develop your skills at the game. You can learn alongside him. This probably all sounds very cheesy, but I can't help but to feel that way whenever I use him. May, as you could imagine, is quite the different character. She's much more balanced. She has less attack, HP, and isn't quite as fast, but she makes up for this with her good defense. It's reasonably easy to imagine that this shows right back to her personality and her motivations for fighting. May is much more driven than Ken. She has a reason for fighting more than just for her own sake and because it's fun. She wants revenge for her father's becoming, and she's determined to get it. She's not brash about it like Ken, however, and this is shown through the way the game encourages you to employ her through the stats it assigns. While not as strong or energetic as Ken is, she accommodates for it in her more composed, team-oriented fighting style. Being slightly slower and not as strong encourages a frontline offensive, but a more tightly knit one. It's much less tempting to send her off into the heat of battle to ward off 3 enemies at a time. She acts as a pretty versatile, tanky character, and that's without even factoring her defining trait, her defense, which only adds to this idea. She doesn't have much HP, but she's able to take a number of hits in contrast to that of Ken. This is a nice reflection of the personality differences between the two. Because of this great difference in defense, May comes off as much more mature and driven than Ken, which makes a lot of sense given that Ken is only along for the ride to have fun, while May is there for much more serious reasons. She's determined to achieve her goals, and so it makes sense that she'd be able to stay up longer and take more hits than Ken, who doesn't have the same drives. The defense also acts as a double-edged sword, because it also plays nicely with the team-oriented kind of fighting style. Mei realizes that she cannot accomplish her goals on her own, and so she knows that she must act with the best interest of the team. She must protect the squishier members so that the team can function at its most efficient. So in a way, the game is encouraging the player to utilize her in a way that not only develops her character, but also acts as a good core to build the party around in the early game. Moving on to a couple of the healers in the game, the first two that we encounter are Lo and Gong. Lo is one of the original party members and is established to be the main character's best friend. As per usual, we get a few lines of dialogue explaining this to us, and the rest of the development is left to the actions taken in the battles themselves. Gong is the first character in the game that is entirely missable. He's an optional character that can be found by visiting a log cabin outside of the first battle. Being an optional character, his role in the story is that he essentially doesn't have one. He has one or two lines of dialogue when you meet him, and then that's it. He shuts up for the rest of the game. For a character like this, as you can imagine, the characterization through numbers becomes very important. Now, on to combat. Lo is a pretty standard healer. That might make it sound like he's pretty replaceable and boring, but that's not the case. This is actually his strong suit. Lo does everything you could want from a healer, and proficiently. He always seems to be there when you need him to be. His overall defining characteristic would have to be his reliability. Just like a good friend, he's there to support you when you need him, to bail you out when you screw up or get in over your head. This probably sounds like your average healer, but it should be emphasized just how useful he makes himself. He has a good amount of magic points to expend on heals, and he has the speed to get there. He's not quick, but he could certainly be much slower, and that's perfect. You don't want him to outpace the majority of your frontliners so that he has no one to heal, and you don't want him to be lagging too far behind because then he wouldn't get there in time. He has just the right speed and a good variety of support spells to make sure everyone else is operating at their full potential. It's not difficult to feel the friendly aura that Lo has to him. The game really makes him feel like a friendly character instead of just telling you that he is. Gong is a bit different. You see, Gong is not your typical healer, he's a monk. This means that in addition to healing, he can also fight if you need him to. He's also the first character that we encounter in the game that does not use a weapon, which is important to note as it essentially allows him to have an extra item slot. Gong is a bit of a jack of all trades. He's not really great at anything, but he can do just about anything you would need him to. He can take a couple hits, deal out decent damage, and also heal. He doesn't have as many magic points as Lo, so he can't heal as much, and he doesn't have the combative stats that any of your other fighters have, but he does have a decent balance of them all. The extra item slot can also be taken advantage of to give him an extra healing item to help account for this lack of healing ability, but even with that he still doesn't quite reach the healing capacity that Lo has. I would say that Gong is the first cool character in the game. Up till this point, it had pretty much been established that the support classes could not really engage in combat at all. They would deal piss poor damage and die in just a couple hits. Gong was the antithesis of those rules set in place, and the game made it feel like he was breaking those rules. The fact that he was this kind of secret character also added to this feeling. With his decent stats across the board, it really set him apart from the rest of the cast. It made him seem cool. He was a support class that could also hold his own, and it really felt like he shouldn't be able to. But he could, and that really defined him. While all this is great, it makes it difficult to classify him as a dedicated healer within the context of the game. He isn't nearly as reliable as Lo is, and this is probably his biggest weakness. You need to make room for him as the game goes on if you want to keep him in your party. You can't justify bringing him along simply because he's a healer. Regardless, he's a very fun character and a joy to play. Speaking of cool characters in Shining Force, undoubtedly the coolest of them all is Xylo. Xylo's a werewolf, which is quite a bit different from what had been established up till this point in the game. He's the first character that doesn't look like a human, and he seems out of place, though not for long. We first meet Xylo in the town of Bustoke, where we find him locked up in a cave and crazed. We find out that the enemy has gone out of their way to poison him to send him into this frenzy. Xylo was greatly admired by the villagers, but they were forced to lock him up once he was poisoned for their own safety. And just with that, we have a great introduction to his character. One of the better ones in the game, as there's some actual story here. We know that he's a greatly respected, honorable person, and some kind of real badass to attract enemy attention like that. Shortly after meeting him, we beat the enemy back from the village and find a cure for him in the form of something called Lunar Dew. Once ingested, Xylo returns to his normal self, expressing his gratitude and joining the party. As is the case, on the battlefield is where his character really begins to shine. Being a werewolf, naturally he doesn't use any dedicated weapons, and he is comparable in speed and movement to the centaurs. He also hits hard and has some decent defense and HP stats. I'm not gonna beat around the bush with this one, or explicate upon how playing him teaches you the game, or how his character undergoes this great development like the other characters I've gone over so far, because that's just not the case. Xylo is cool and overpowered. Broken almost. From the point he joins the Force to the end of the game, he's one of the strongest and most useful fighters. He takes a slight dip around the mid-game where he levels out with the rest of your fighters, but otherwise, he's ridiculous. He's a contrast to the rest of the game so far, but a welcomed one. He's a nice fresh breath of air, a different kind of character that we get to play around with. And that difference also helps to separate him from the rest of the party, further cementing his distinctiveness and unique qualities that make him feel completely differently from anyone else on the Force. His inclusion feels necessary, like he has a place, a role to serve, and he does, as a fun character that makes it feel as if you were entirely dominating the enemy. Similarly to Raiden, really, and this is made brilliantly clear from the first fight. The first battle that you have Xylo for takes place outside of town in a forested area. Unlike what we've grown accustomed to with all of the others, Xylo does not take movement penalties through forested tiles, so while the other party members are traveling 2 to 3 squares per turn, Xylo gets to travel his full 7. This combined with his good speed means that he's able to be just about anywhere on the battlefield. He's able to run from one end of the battlefield to the other in just a turn and deal a devastating blow to one of the enemies. It feels as if though he's carrying the party, even though they'd probably be fine without him. His impact is immediate, and it's difficult to imagine the battle without him in it. His presence in that battle is so great that it becomes more about him than anything else. He's instantly established as an incredible fighter and a monster on the battlefield. He differs from a lot of the cast in that he doesn't intentionally support the rest of the party, but it ends up working out anyway. The game makes it feel as if he's this raging beast who moves from one enemy to the next, chopping them down, and his unbelievable stats encourage you to do so. You are prodded to throw him at an enemy, make quick work of them, and move on to the next. And so while not intentionally aiding the party, Xylo inevitably takes out the enemy at crucial moments as a result of the nature of his character, making him feel like a team player at the same time. He walks that line of being a monster and doing what he wants, and helping out the team, which one could expect from a werewolf with a debt to pay. Moving from the front row to the back, we have our magic users. The two that I would like to highlight here are my two favorite in the game, Henri and Domingo. Henri is established to be the daughter of the King of Guardiana, who was killed along with Varios in the invasion. She's next in line to the throne, but is away studying magic at the Arcane College in Manarina, and so it is the first task of the player to track her down and inform her of her father's demise and her unfortunate ascension to the throne. As one could imagine, she's quite distressed to hear this news, but upon some comforting, she decides that she must assume her new role as queen and look after her kingdom. She joins the party and heads off with Hugh to defend her newly acquired citizens and nation. Henri is probably the most fleshed out character in terms of the actual story being told, and it's more than welcome because it's actually very good. While in Manarina, you can also come across Domingo, or his egg at least. Domingo is another one of those optional characters, so in contrast to Henri, he really has no story whatsoever. You can find his egg in the college, and later on in the game, you will find someone to hatch it for you. This isn't as easy as it sounds, and you really have to be searching around to get him, or at least that's what you would have done in the days before strategy guides or the internet. Domingo is established as some kind of magical creature, an alien perhaps, and that's about all we get of him. Henri is another one of those glass cannon type characters, but in the back row this time. She has very little health and doesn't have much defense to bolster that. She doesn't want to attack given her mediocre attack, being a spellcaster, and weak defensive game, but that's all okay because she has some of the best magic points in the game. She's an interesting character to play because she is a glass cannon, but she also kind of isn't. She is compliant in the definition in that she'll die in a hit, 2 if you're lucky, but she differs in that her damage is dealt over time rather than all at once. This is similar to other spellcasters, but it's really taken to the extreme in her case. With some of the other spellcasters in the game, you can take more of a risk to deal out huge amounts of damage quickly, but with her, you really have to be more measured, which really does reflect back onto her personality. Henri is quite cool-headed, as we saw with how she reacted to learning that her father had passed away. She was able to pick herself back up quickly and keep in mind her kingdom and her people. She's willing to play the long game because she's in it for everyone else and wants only to bring peace. Henri has lived a more pampered life than the majority of the party, and so she's fragile, but that hasn't diminished her talent or her intelligence. She has a good range of spells that she doesn't take too long to learn, and so she finds herself useful for just about the entire game, which can also be viewed as a product of her intelligence. Domingo couldn't be a more different spellcaster. He's everything that Henri isn't, and Henri is everything that Domingo isn't. Domingo has by far the highest defense and HP of the bunch, but he lags behind in MP and spell selection. He's versatile in his movement because he can float and he has good speed, which the others can't boast. He's quite the strange spellcaster. He's not great at casting spells, but he is great at getting down and dirty in the heat of the fight. Domingo as a character is very strange, and this is reflected in his stats. He's like no other character in the game, on the battlefield and as a character himself. He's just this thing that's not really human, and he looks kind of squishy. In a fight, however, he's not squishy at all. In fact, it's even difficult for me to view him as squishy anymore. I've grown so accustomed to seeing his character design on the receiving end of an attack and knowing that he'll be fine, that I view him as a rather tough-looking character and not squishy at all. It really adds to this mysterious strangeness that surrounds him. It feels quite relieving to be able to send a spellcaster onto the front lines in order to score a hard-to-reach kill. Any other magic user would either not be able to reach because they can't float, or you really wouldn't want to do so because they would end up dead almost instantly. He reminds me of Gong in that sense. What you can do with him doesn't really feel like it should be working, and that's a really cool feeling which blends well with his character. The difference there being that Domingo does it better, because he most certainly is the better character. He's good right up until the end of the game. Domingo is a very strange character, and I love him for that. He's a ton of fun to play, and I always make sure I pick him up. Shining Force is filled with these strange characters like Domingo, which is something I personally find quite endearing about it, and you don't even have to look past the Centaur class to find some of them. Guns and Kokichi both stretch what the Centaur class is, and are a more than welcome addition to spice things up with this large cast of characters. Guns is an armadillo in a steam suit. I don't think I have to explain why that makes him a distinct character. He's another optional character, and is acting as a test subject for the scientist who developed the suit, Dr. Croc. He doesn't have much reason for fighting other than to test out the suit. It's Dr. Croc who sends him to you, because it's him who wants to help out what he sees as the good side. Kokichi is on the other side of that relationship. Kokichi is that quirky scientist, except that it is he himself who is using his own inventions. He's developed a flying machine that he uses to fly around the battlefield. He's also an optional character, so there isn't really much in the way of characterization through dialogue for either of them. As you could imagine, Guns is the definitive tank of the game. He has the highest defense of any party member, and decent HP to boot. He's also got good attack, so he's not just a damage sponge. The obvious failing to his character is in his abysmal speed and movement range. His speed is one of the worst in the game, and his movement is tied for the worst with only 4 squares. He has a lot of trouble reaching the enemy and keeping up with the rest of the force in general. This isn't the end of the world, as his movement can be bolstered by items. However, there are only 2 such items in the game, and so it's left up to the player to make that decision. He's also not affected by terrain like the centaurs and other classes, so outside he always does get his 4 movement squares, which is a nice asset to have. This all makes Guns feel really heavy. Everything about him is substantial, and any move you make must be deliberate to get the most out of him. Guns must be carefully positioned so that he's able to keep up with the rest of the party and be in the spot he is needed to absorb all the damage coming the party's way. A tank can be described as looking after the rest of the party, and Guns absolutely fills this role. With his high defense and easygoing, fun-seeking personality, he can easily be imagined taking the hit for one of the other party members. This is all pretty simple characterization, and it can be found in a lot of games. I'm sure that just describing Guns here probably brought to mind a few other characters who fulfill the same roles and share the same traits. The tank is one of those roles that most games seem to know how to handle, but moving past that they seem to run into trouble for whatever reason. If I had to guess, I'd say that most games start out with the idea of wanting a tank character and then building from there. With most other characters, I imagine it's probably the other way around. so that when they get to how they want the character to differ from the rest of the cast in the statistical sense, they either don't think about it at all, or don't have much of an idea about how to make it happen. Gunce sounds a lot like your average tank character in the game, but there's something that differentiates him from the rest. It's more of a feeling, and I can't quite put my finger on what exactly it is that differentiates him so much from other tank characters in other games, which I know is a shame because that's the whole point of the video and the thing I'm supposed to be doing here. If I had to say, I'd probably have to say his dynamic with the rest of the party and his animations. His animations are distinctive, but I'd say they play a lesser role than the former. Gunce really feels like he has a place on the Force. He works really well with the other members, and it feels as if he was made to be there and was more than just a tank character. Like he was built for a purpose, with the rest of the party in mind. Kokichi really couldn't be any different from Gunce in the statistical sense, even though they share the same weapon types and class. Think Henri and Domingo. Kokichi's flyer gives him one of the best movements in the game. He moves 6 spaces, which is one less than the Centaurs or Silo, but he isn't affected by any terrain or some traditionally impassable squares such as mountains, which even a floater like Domingo can't flaunt. This combined with the fact that he's a knight makes him one of the most versatile characters in the game. Kokichi is faster than Gunce and has slightly more HP, but Gunce outclasses him in both attack and defense. He's really mediocre in almost every way, except for his movement and versatility that define him. This makes him one of the only characters in the game that is almost completely overtaken by one aspect of the consequences of their stats. The other characters may have a defining aspect, but they will normally have something else that they are also good at that plays into their character dynamic. This not only makes for an interesting character, but it also plays into who he is. Kokichi is just an average old guy who has a knack for inventing and a crazy enough mind to test them out himself. It makes sense that his stats should be low. This is more than supplemented for by the augmentations that he gives to himself though. It's his ingenuity that makes up for the physical deficiencies. In that sense he's rather similar to Gunce and Dr. Croc, except valuing mobility over brute strength. His stats really enforce that he must be taken care of, because he doesn't do well on his own, given his lack of combat stats. You have to use him carefully and tactfully to get the most out of him. You can't rush him in the battle like the Centaurs, because he can't handle that kind of fighting anymore. He's old and he's fairly weak. Granted, Kokichi isn't the most interesting character in the game, nor is he the best handled of the bunch, but I still think he's worth a look at. And those are all the characters that I'll talk about in depth, but there are so many characters in this game that I'd like to give some mention to a few of them before I wrap this up here. So here we go. Rapid fire. Blue is a baby dragon when you find him, and is a bit of a scaredy cat before undergoing some development and becoming a hesitant but willing fighter. He actually gets more dialogue and cutscene development than most of the other characters. The game intentionally gives him to you at a low level and weaker than the rest of your party. The player must invest the effort in furthering his development by putting in the time and strategic planning to grow him as a character, and as the game progresses, he actually becomes one of the strongest and coolest members of the Force. Musashi is a samurai that is recruited late in the game. He is devastating in close quarters with great stats all around, but it's his getting there that's the issue. He's excruciatingly slow with below average movement. The game does a great job making him feel like an actual samurai and a fearsome warrior not to be reckoned with. Luke and Gort are both warriors that join the party early in the game. Luke is one of the original band of friends, while Gort is an older retired fighter who joins the Force after the invasion of Guardiana. Luke has slightly more attack and speed, which makes him feel more youthful than his older counterpart who specializes more in defense, although both of them have great defenses. These two could have had a larger section dedicated to them, and have been better characters if they were more offbeat with one another statistically. They're just too similar to draw a great divide between the two, which is a shame, because they're both enjoyable and useful throughout the entirety of the game. For all of my praise of the way Shining Force uses its stats to characterize its characters, I'll be the first to admit that it doesn't get it perfect. For instance, Adam is a robot that you get late in the game. They tried pulling the same thing with him that they did with Blue, but it didn't work out nearly as well. He joins much weaker comparatively than Blue did, and there are very few battles left in the game at the point you receive him. If you want to use him, you'll be forced to grind for hours on end just to get him up to speed for the last few battles before the game ends. There's also not any reason for him to be weak when he joins the Force either. It's not like Blue where it's justified through his character and then rewarding for the player when they do put the effort in. Adam is one of the strongest characters in the game, but the game in actuality isn't that difficult and you don't really need him. So why put the time in? Aleph and Tarasu also face similar problems in that they come into the game too late. Both are good characters, especially Tarasu, but if you want to get them up to speed, you'll have to baby them up until near the end of the game and possibly even do some grinding along the way. Musashi comes into the game late, but he was done well because he came in just as strong or stronger than most of the party, so I'm not really sure what they were thinking with these characters. The other flyers apart from Kokichi in the game are Amon and Balbaroi, who are bird people. They're the only character type that uses swords, except for the player character, for the majority of the game, and the only characters other than Kokichi who can fly. The issue with them is that they are simply not that good. They can hit decently, but they can't take more than a couple hits, which makes them less than ideal for the front lines where they most likely will be found. In my opinion, they're more of a pain to use than they are worth, and Kokichi basically outclasses them in every way, so they have little use. They do distinguish themselves from each other decently well enough, and as a character concept they're interesting and work well within the game, but they aren't good enough to really take advantage of the characterization methods that Shining Force implements, and so unfortunately, both of them fall flat. Continuing on with the problems, archers are a notorious one in this game. Frankly, they suck. All of their stats are mediocre. All of them. They do have range, but so do the knight classes and spellcasters. Archers do eventually get a range of 3 spaces, but the majority of spellcasters, including Ornery and Domingo, get spells that can reach 3 spaces as well. Lyle is kind of an exception to this rule. He's better than the rest of them, and he's a centaur, so he does have improved movement, but he's still not great. He has good attack, but nothing crazy enough to set off any alarms. For the most part, I'd say avoid archers unless you really want to use one. The overabundance of knights and centaurs is also an issue. The game does a decent job at diversifying with characters such as Lyle and Kokichi, but there are a lot of them, and the game doesn't come up with enough ways to accentuate their differences enough. At some point they start to blend together and lose their individual personalities. The strongest personalities with the most interesting twists on the formula do fine, but others, unfortunately, don't fare so well. This characterization method is clearly not easy to pull off, just judging by how many characters they couldn't get quite right and the lack of success found in other games with multiple playable characters. Looking at the subtleties in their stats is tricky and difficult to manage. They can be so similar, but somehow they can make the characters feel so differently from one another. Despite the game's failures, I applaud them wholeheartedly for trying to pull this off. I think they mostly succeeded. They managed to create a great cast of characters using almost nothing but the battle system, and made the characterization and development feel natural in the process. More natural than many other games are able to accomplish with many more resources at their disposal. It impresses me more every time I play it, as I'm able to recognize new subtleties in the characters and learn them further. I maintain that Shining Force has one of my favorite casts in all of video games, and I am proud to call them such. Maybe I'm looking too far into this, and all this characterization wasn't intentional at all, if it can even be said to exist in the first place. I think it's possible this may be the case, but I clearly also think there's some truth to this. Despite whether it exists in Shining Force or not, and despite the intentionality, the interpretation can still be made, and I think that's where we can find our truth. The simple fact that this can be an interpretation suggests that it is possible in some capacity in some game. This is a truth I'm quite fond of and would like to keep. I think there to be greater value in this viewpoint, and I think we can definitely see this concept working in other games such as those I had brought up prior. In conclusion, I suppose this is my attempt to bring light to this concept. I think there is a lot of value to be derived from this idea, and I would like to see more games pay attention to how they are using their numbers. From everything from spectacle fighters to fighting games to tactical RPGs. I don't think games are doing a particularly good job of this at the moment, with exceptions of course, namely fighting games along with some others. To reiterate, I think this is probably due to the negative view of numbers that we have, being cold, logical, and devoid of emotion. So, actually, in conclusion, I wish that games would pay more attention to their numbers and how their dismissal of them is potentially negatively impacting themselves, or at least adding nothing of value when they could be making them so much better by supplementing the entire experience in more ways than we could imagine. Hey, what's up? Mitopphic here. If you made it this far, it means you watched the entire video. Thank you for that. I know this was a long one. This has been by far my largest project yet. So, if you have any thoughts on the subject, I would love to hear them down below in the comments section. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.